Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Today we are taking a deep dive into the historical institution of the shogun, a crucial part of the Japanese history series.
Right, and to really grasp this, you have to consider a military dictator who commands massive armies.
Yeah, someone who controls the agricultural wealth of an entire nation.
Exactly, and possesses the power of life and death over millions of subjects.
And the thing is, in almost any other historical context, across any other continent, that individual just marches their army right into the capital.
They depose the monarch and claim the throne for themselves.
Right. The consolidation of hard military power almost universally results in acquiring the formal title of sovereign.
The standard historical pattern usually demands that the person wielding the monopoly on violence also claims the supreme religious or legal legitimacy of the state.
Because when you hold all the practical cards, you generally take the crown to formalize your dominance.
But when we look at the history of Japan, that established pattern simply does not apply.
It really doesn't. For nearly 700 years, the supreme military rulers of Japan, the shoguns, wielded absolute executive power.
They engineered entire societies and managed these intensely complex feudal hierarchies.
Yeah, and shaped the borders and the culture of Japan from the late Heian period all the way to the Meiji Restoration in the 19th century.
And throughout all of those centuries, the emperor, who held virtually no military or economic power, remained the symbolic head of state.
So the shogun held the real executive authority.
Right, while the emperor served as a figurehead, retaining that symbolic and religious legitimacy.
Because the emperor was considered a living deity, right?
Exactly, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. And that lineage made the imperial institution essentially untouchable.
So the shogun, regardless of his military might, ruled technically in the name of the emperor.
It is a distinct political phenomenon where physical force continuously deferred to theoretical authority.
Now, to understand how this system functioned, we are looking at a wide range of sources for you today. We have detailed historical analyses, extensive accounts of the shifting feudal systems across multiple eras, and granular economic data spanning several centuries of Japanese history.
We will chart the evolution of this office over 7 centuries.
Yeah, which requires examining how these military commanders consolidated their power.
And how they adapted to severe internal and external threats.
Right, and how they ultimately built one of the most strictly controlled societies in human history.
So our mission today is to understand the mechanics of this enduring power structure.
Exactly. How did a military dictator rule Japan for centuries without ever claiming the throne?
Well, to answer that, we have to move backward, before the first official shogunate even existed.
We need to look at the literal words used to define this power. We shorten it to shogun, but the sources are clear that this is only an abbreviation.
Right, so let's unpack the actual full title.
Okay,
The full historical title is Seitei Shogun.
Seitei Taishogun.
Yeah, and to grasp the origin of the office, we must break down the kanji, the characters that make up that specific title.
Okay.
So the first component is sei, which translates to conquer or subjugate.
Subjugate.
And following that is e, which means barbarian or savage.
Subjugate the barbarians.
Exactly. Then the second half of the title provides the military context. Tai means great.
Okay.
Sho means commander, and gun means army.
So you put it all together, and the literal translation of Sei Taishogun is commander-in-chief of the expeditionary force against the barbarians.
That is the precise literal meaning. And it really reveals the role's original design and purpose.
Which takes us back to the 8th and 9th centuries, right?
Yes, during the early Heian period, the imperial court was based in the capital of Heian-kyo.
Which is modern-day Kyoto.
Right, and they were attempting to consolidate and expand their influence over the Japanese archipelago.
But they encountered formidable resistance in the northern regions of Honshu.
From indigenous tribal groups known collectively as the Emashi.
And these were populations living entirely outside of imperial control.
Yeah, maintaining their own distinct culture and military tactics.
Because they resisted the central authority, the court labeled them as barbarians.
Exactly. The Emashi utilized highly effective guerrilla warfare tactics.
Like what, specifically?
Well, they relied heavily on horseback archery and their intimate knowledge of the rugged northern terrain.
And the imperial court's standard infantry just couldn't handle that.
No, they were largely composed of conscripted peasants, and they suffered heavy defeats trying to pacify these frontier threats.
I see. So the emperor realized that controlling distant, complex military operations from a palace in Kyoto was logistically unfeasible.
They needed a dedicated specialist in the field, So they created a specific job title for the general sent north to handle the situation.
The commander-in-chief.
Right. The first documented bestowal of this specific title occurred in the year 797.
797, okay.
Emperor Kanmu appointed a court noble and highly capable general named Sakanue no Tamaramaro as Sei Taishogun.
And his mandate was explicitly singular, right?
Entirely singular.
Oh.
To command the forces necessary to subdue the Emishi resistance and bring the northern provinces under imperial taxation and control.
It is crucial to note for you listening that this was not a political office. Sakanure no Tamaramaro wasn't governing the nation.
No, this was a temporary, ad hoc field commission.
And entirely non-hereditary.
Exactly. Once the military campaign concluded and the frontier was secured, the title effectively went dormant.
The individual holding the title ranked above provincial governors during the campaign.
But upon returning to Kyoto, they were reabsorbed into the standard imperial bureaucracy.
Sitting below the core civilian ministers.
Yeah, it was just a military utility.
Yeah.
Designed to be deployed and then discarded when the violence was finished.
How then do we get from a temporary general fighting frontier skirmishes in the late 8th century to a hereditary dictator ruling the entire country?
Right. There is a massive leap between Sakanure no Tamaramaro and the shoguns we see later in history.
That shift requires us to examine the broader state of Japan between the 10th and 12th centuries.
The centralized aristocratic government in Kyoto, heavily dominated by the powerful Fujiwara clan, began to experience a severe structural collapse of governance.
Well, governance usually collapses when the money stops flowing. I am assuming this started with the economy and the administration of land.
You're right. The Kyoto aristocracy lived in an atmosphere of intense cultural refinement.
They dedicated their lives to poetry, calligraphy, and court intrigue.
Yeah, heavily insulated from the practical realities of the provinces. But their extravagant lifestyle relied entirely on taxes generated from vast agricultural estates scattered across the country.
And over time, their ability to effectively administer those distant estates deteriorated.
The nobles in Kyoto were not going out to the provinces to ensure the rice was harvested and the taxes were collected.
They relied on local administrators.
And when those local administrators realized the central government lacked the power to enforce its will, corruption flourished.
Tax collection became highly unreliable.
Estates were consolidated by powerful local families who simply stopped sending revenue back to Kyoto.
And when the capital cannot collect taxes, the capital cannot fund its own centralized military forces or police.
Exactly. The central law enforcement essentially vanishes.
So the imperial court is sitting in Kyoto, their revenue is drying up, and they have no physical force to go out and compel the provinces to pay.
The court faced a logistical nightmare. They still required order on the provincial estates to receive any revenue, but they lack the coercive power to enforce that order.
So what was their solution?
They outsourced the violence.
They outsourced it.
They turned to local provincial warrior clans and delegated the authority to keep the peace, suppress local banditry, and ensure the flow of resources back to the capital.
I struggle to see the logic in the imperial court's strategy here.
Really? How so?
By delegating their monopoly on violence to provincial warriors, simply because it was too difficult to manage from the capital, didn't the aristocracy effectively sign their own death warrant? If you hand over the military enforcement and the local tax collection to someone else, you are handing over the actual levers of state power. You are making the samurai completely indispensable.
You are. But the aristocracy likely viewed it as a pragmatic, temporary solution, conceptually similar to the original ad hoc shogun appointments.
Okay, I see.
The nobles possessed an intense belief in their own innate superiority. They assumed the theoretical religious authority of the emperor, combined with the immense cultural prestige of the court, would naturally keep the provincial warriors subservient.
They viewed these warriors as uncultured, rustic mercenaries who would be honored just to serve the capital.
Exactly. But relying on someone else's swords inevitably leads to those swordsmen realizing they hold all the actual leverage.
Right. Why take orders from a distant, perfumed aristocrat who cannot even defend his own palace?
When you are the one wearing the armor, wielding the weapons, and physically controlling the agricultural land. That realization incubated among the provincial military families for decades. These warriors were doing the actual grueling work of governing, policing, and defending the land.
Yet they were treated with immense condescension by the Kyoto nobles.
And the tension between the nominal civilian rulers in the capital and the de facto military powers in the provinces created a deeply unstable environment.
It created a powder keg. And that tension ultimately detonated into a massive civil war that fundamentally altered the Japanese political landscape and birthed the first permanent military government.
Right, we enter the late 12th century, defined by the Genpei War.
The Genpei War.
This was a brutal, sweeping conflict fought not against external barbarians, but between the two most powerful provincial warrior coalitions in Japan, the Taira clan and the Minamoto clan.
And the old aristocratic system collapsed completely under the weight of this war.
Completely. The conflict was no longer about the emperor asserting control over the provinces. It was a pure power struggle to determine which warrior clan would establish absolute dominance over the other.
And this war consumed the nation.
It raged until April of 1185. It culminated decisively at the naval battle of Dan-no-ura.
In the straits separating the islands of Honshu and Kyushu.
Right, and there, the Minamoto clan fleet completely annihilated the Taira forces.
The sources describe the waters turning red.
Yes, and in the chaos, the child emperor Antoku, who's backed by the Taira, drowned when his grandmother plunged into the sea with him, rather than face capture.
That moment at Dan-no-ura is a grim illustration of how power had shifted. The emperor himself was now just a pawn being fought over by military families.
The leader of the victorious Minamoto clan was a man named Minamoto no Yoritomo.
Minamoto no Yoritomo.
And after securing total victory, he did not return to the subservient role of a provincial lord waiting on the Kyoto court. He established a completely new paradigm.
He effectively seized national executive power.
He did. However, he made a deeply consequential geographic decision. He did not attempt to integrate his massive military apparatus into the existing imperial court in Kyoto.
Right. Instead, he established his headquarters far to the east, in Kamakura.
Right.
Setting up hundreds of miles away from the emperor is a very clear statement. He was not trying to take over the existing civilian bureaucracy. He was building a parallel structure entirely.
He established a feudal military administration heavily focused on controlling the warrior class. And to legitimize this new reality, in 1192, Emperor Go-Toba officially bestowed upon Yoritomo that old, dormant title.
Minamoto no Yoritomo was appointed Seita Shogun.
But we are no longer talking about a temporary field commission to fight northern tribes.
No, the context of the title completely changed.
By regularizing his position with this specific title, Yoritomo became the first shogun in the usually understood sense of a national military dictator.
He transformed the office into a permanent institution.
This marks the formal beginning of the Kamakura Shogunate, which endured from 1185 until 1333.
Now, the sources refer to the shogun's new government as the Bakufu. We need to dissect that term because it reveals how these rulers viewed themselves.
Right. Bakufu literally translates to tent government.
Tent government.
It evokes the imagery of a military commander's temporary field headquarters, a transient encampment set up during a military campaign.
Using the term tent government for a permanent national administration is fascinating. It is essentially declaring a perpetual state of emergency.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it.
The shogun is keeping a military field command active during peacetime, specifically to bypass the traditional slow-moving civilian bureaucracy of the imperial court. It implies that martial law is now the permanent law of the land.
The tent government symbolized that the shogun's authority was rooted strictly in martial discipline, direct command, and absolute loyalty, rather than the entrenched, protocol-heavy aristocratic monarchy of Kyoto.
And Yoritomo used this streamlined military structure to implement sweeping administrative reforms.
He didn't just hold a grand title. He engineered a practical system to physically control the Japanese archipelago.
And Japan is a geographically difficult country to control. It is heavily mountainous, composed of hundreds of islands with valleys cut off from one another.
Exactly.
You cannot just issue a decree from Kamakura and expect it to be enforced hundreds of miles away in Kyushu. How did the Bakufu actually function on a local level?
Yoritomo solved the geographic problem through the strategic distribution of loyal vassals.
Right.
He created the position of shugo,
Sugu?
which translates to provincial military governors. Their primary responsibility was to maintain order, police the provinces, suppress rebellion, and handle all military matters on a regional level.
He established a network of military chiefs who bypassed the old imperial governors and answered directly to him.
Alongside the shugo, he appointed individuals to the role of hido, who served as land stewards.
Land stewards.
The hidos were assigned to manage the vast agricultural estates, And crucially, many of these estates were the newly confiscated lands of the defeated Terra clan.
Right.
The Shido were responsible for managing the land and, most importantly, collecting the taxes.
There is the economic engine. By placing his own loyal vassals as Hito on these estates, Yoritomo took direct control of the revenue stream.
He circumvented the old Kyoto aristocrats who had previously relied on that exact same income.
He secured the unwavering loyalty of his samurai retainers by granting them these lucrative, powerful positions.
The Kamakura Bakufu functioned as a strictly land-based vassalage system. Military loyalty and service to the shogun were rewarded directly with land management rights and a cut of the tax revenue.
If the shogun controls the military through the shugo, and he controls the economy through the hito, what exactly is left for the emperor sitting in Kyoto?
This creates the dual power structure that defines the era. The emperor remained the absolute, unchallengeable source of religious and cultural legitimacy.
The imperial court symbolized continuity and the sacred origins of the nation.
But religious legitimacy doesn't feed armies or build fortresses.
No, it doesn't.
The emperor wielded virtually no de facto political or military control. However, Yoritomo understood a critical political reality. The shogun could not claim the throne outright.
Because the legitimacy of the shogun's absolute rule was strictly delimited to acting on the emperor's behalf.
Exactly. The Bakufu operated theoretically as an extension of imperial will, a military instrument wielded by the gods.
The shogun was the ultimate executive authority, making all the actual decisions, but he had to maintain the legal fiction that he was merely a subordinate military deputy.
And that legal fiction provided a necessary stability. It precluded the shogun from attempting to become a monarch, a move that would have instantly invited challenges from every other powerful warrior clan who could claim an equal right to rule by force.
Because they could just say, well, if you can take the throne, so can we.
Right. The system required formal reconfirmation from each successive emperor to maintain the shogun's aura of legitimacy.
It is a delicate balance of power, but Minamoto no Yoritomo passes away in 1199.
Yes, and in any hereditary system, the death of a strong, unifying founder is usually where the structure begins to fracture.
The Kamakura Shogunate certainly faced immediate internal crises. Yoritomo's direct heirs proved to be highly ineffective leaders.
Yet, the military government did not collapse. Instead, the real locus of power shifted slightly behind the curtain.
It shifted to his widow, right?
Yes, the power shifted to Hojo Masako and her extended family, the Hojo clan. Following Yoritomo's death, Masako, who later became known as the Nun Shogun, orchestrated a series of ruthless political maneuvers.
She and her family marginalized Yoritomo's weak successors and assumed the role of regents for the shoguns.
Exactly.
Let me make sure I have this layered hierarchy correct. We have an emperor who is a figurehead for a shogun, and now the shogun is becoming a figurehead for a regent.
The layers of indirect rule are a defining characteristic of Japanese political history.
It's very complex.
By 1205, the Minamoto shoguns were largely confined to ceremonial roles within Kamakura, while the Hojo regency wielded the actual executive power of the Bakufu.
And the Hojo ruled through councils of state for deliberations and administrative boards for finances.
Sustaining their operations through intricate familial alliances and swift purges of rivals.
And it was under the administration of the Hojo regency that the Kamakura Shogunate faced its ultimate existential test.
This was not a rebellion of unhappy samurai. This was a threat from the outside world.
The Mongol invasions.
Kublai Khan, the ruler of the massive Mongol Empire that had already conquered vast swaths of Asia and China, set his sights across the sea to Japan.
This represents the defining military conflict of the era, testing the samurai against a completely foreign method of warfare.
In 1274, the Mongols launched their first invasion. They sent a fleet across the strait carrying approximately 15,000 to 40,000 heavily armed troops.
That is a massive force.
And they made landfall in Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands.
The Japanese samurai were accustomed to ritualistic combat, They were used to riding out, announcing their lineage, and engaging in single combat with a worthy opponent.
But the Mongols did not fight that way.
No, they didn't.
The samurai defenses were severely tested. The Mongols utilized tightly coordinated infantry formations, heavy phalanxes, and volley fire from archers utilizing poisoned arrows.
And furthermore, the Mongols deployed early forms of explosive weapons, right?
Yes, ceramic shells filled with gunpowder that terrified the Japanese horses and shattered their formations.
But despite facing tactics and weapons they had never seen before, the samurai managed to hold the line, fighting a brutal, bloody defense on the beaches.
But the decisive factor wasn't necessarily the swordsmanship.
What was it?
What truly saved the Kamakura forces was a severe weather event.
A typhoon.
A massive typhoon swept through the strait and destroyed a significant portion of the Mongol fleet as they attempted to retreat to their ships to weather the night. The invasion force was heavily degraded and forced to withdraw.
But Kublai Khan was not the type of ruler to accept a single defeat and give up.
No, he spent the next 7 years preparing a much larger armada. In 1281, he returned.
1281.
And this time, an estimated 140,000 soldiers descended on Japan.
140,000 troops in the 13th century is a staggering logistical achievement. It is a terrifying prospect for the defenders.
It was one of the largest naval invasions in human history prior to the 20th century.
But the Kamakura Bakufu had not been idle during those 7 years.
No, they had expended massive resources constructing fortified stone defensive walls along the coastline of Hakata Bay.
So when the Mongols arrived, the samurai engaged in brutal, close-quarters combat for weeks along these walls.
Utilizing small boats to raid the massive Mongol ships at night, preventing the invaders from establishing a solid beachhead.
It is a grinding, desperate war of attrition. And then the weather intervenes again.
History repeated itself in the most dramatic manner imaginable. Another massive, highly destructive typhoon struck the coast.
The storm decimated the massive Mongol fleet,
Sinking ships, drowning tens of thousands of invaders, and forcing the survivors to abandon the campaign entirely.
The Japanese later mythologized these typhoons as kamikaze, the divine winds.
The narrative was that the gods themselves had intervened to protect the sacred islands of Japan from the barbarians.
The victories preserved Japanese sovereignty. It was an unprecedented, monumental triumph for the Kamakura Bakufu and the entire samurai class.
They had successfully defended the nation against the most formidable, expansive military empire on Earth.
But here is where the narrative takes a sharp turn, and I need you to explain the mechanics of this.
Okay.
How does a government successfully defend its nation against a massive foreign invasion, achieving total victory, only to collapse almost entirely because of that victory?
Right. Well, the answer lies within the foundational economics of the Kamakura system. We discuss how Yoritomo built the Bakufu on a land-based vassalage system.
Yes.
When a samurai fought for the shogun during an internal civil war, the lands of the defeated domestic clan were confiscated. The shogun then distributed that newly acquired land to his loyal warriors as payment and reward for their military service.
Land is the currency of loyalty. But when you are fighting a foreign armada that retreats across the ocean, you cannot confiscate land from a sunken Mongol ship.
Exactly. This was a purely defensive war. The Bakufu expended unimaginable resources over a decade to build the coastal walls, mobilize the armies, and supply the troops.
The samurai left their farms, fought, bled, and died to protect the shogunate.
But when the war finally ended, there was no new territory conquered. There was no confiscated wealth to distribute.
The warriors who saved the nation received absolutely no material reward for their sacrifice.
The lack of compensation imposed a crippling financial burden on the samurai class. They had incurred heavy debts to merchants to arm themselves, feed their retainers, and travel to the front lines in Kyushu.
And when the shogunate failed to reimburse them, massive discontent festered.
The central military government relied entirely on the loyalty of its warriors, and that loyalty was strictly predicated on material reward.
When the shogun's pockets turned out to be empty, the loyalty evaporated. The Kamakura Shogunate was victorious on the battlefield, but financially bankrupt.
The internal weaknesses, the resentment of the unrewarded samurai, and the overall economic strain compounded over the next several decades. By 1333, the entire feudal structure was fractured and ready to break.
And the individual who recognized this weakness and struck the fatal blow was the very symbol of legitimacy who was supposed to remain above the political fray.
Emperor Go-Daigo.
Right.
Recognizing the vulnerability of the Hojo Regency, he rallied dissident provincial warriors, promising them the rewards the bakufu could no longer provide.
He even recruited prominent Kamakura generals who were dissatisfied with the central leadership and launched a direct rebellion.
The imperial forces managed to capture Kamakura in 1333. The sources describe a brutal conclusion, with the Hojo leaders committing mass ritual suicide, effectively ending their regency and the Kamakura bakufu.
The fall of Kamakura underscored the absolute fragility of centralized military governance when divorced from economic realities.
The bakufu proved that physical force and martial discipline were not enough to maintain order once the economic incentives keeping the samurai loyal had collapsed.
The fall of the first tent government proved that a military dictator needed more than just a strong command structure. They needed deep pockets and land to distribute.
Yes.
The next clan to seize power would have to navigate severe financial exhaustion and political fragmentation. As we transition into our next era, we see how this fragmentation led to a period of total chaos, but also, paradoxically, an era of unparalleled cultural growth.
We enter the era of the Ashikaga Shogunate, commonly known as the Muromachi period, spanning from 1336 to 1573.
After Emperor Go-Daigo destroyed the Kamakura Bakufu, he attempted something that no emperor had done in centuries.
He attempted to actually govern the country directly. This brief period is known as the Meiji Restoration. Go-Daigo sought to restore real political and executive power to the imperial court, aiming to completely eliminate the shogunate system and return to an idealized aristocratic past.
I can imagine the warrior class, having tasted executive power and land ownership for over a century, was not about to willingly hand the keys to the country back to the civilian aristocracy.
They vehemently rejected the attempt. The Meiji Restoration was incredibly short-lived.
Ashikaga Takauji, a powerful general who had previously been instrumental in helping Go-Daigo overthrow the Hojo, realized the emperor's new government was alienating the samurai.
So Takauji rebelled against the very emperor he had just helped restore.
He turned his armies right back around, marched on Kyoto, and asserted military dominance.
Ashikaga Takauji captured the capital and established his own bakufu, locating it in the Muromachi district of Kyoto in 1336.
1336?
2 years later, in 1338, he coerced the imperial establishment into officially appointing him as the new Seidi Taishogun.
But this transition of power created a bizarre, highly unstable political reality. Emperor Go-Daigo did not simply surrender and accept his fate.
No, Go-Daigo fled south to the mountainous region of Yoshino. Crucially, he took the imperial regalia with him, the sacred mirror, sword, and jewel that serve as the physical symbols of the throne's legitimacy.
And in response to Go-Daigo's flight, Ashikaga Takauji installed a different compliant member of the imperial family as emperor in Kyoto.
This means Japan now has two rival imperial courts operating simultaneously.
Two courts.
This initiates the Nanbokucho period, translating to the period of the northern and southern courts.
You had the northern court in Kyoto, lacking the sacred regalia, but backed entirely by the massive military apparatus of the Ashikaga Shogunate.
And you had the southern court in Yoshino, possessing the sacred regalia and claiming true legitimacy, led by Go-Daigo and his successors.
This situation completely undermines the theoretical hierarchy we discussed earlier. If the shogun's absolute authority is derived from being the military deputy of the emperor, what happens to that authority when there are two emperors claiming legitimacy, and one of them is actively waging war against the shogun?
It deeply complicated the Ashikaga's claim to absolute authority. The civil war between the factions backing the two courts persisted for decades, draining resources and preventing the shogunate from establishing total control.
So how did they resolve it?
The conflict wasn't resolved until 1392, when the third Ashikaga shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, a highly skilled diplomat and tactician, successfully negotiated a reconciliation, effectively ending the southern court's separate existence and returning the regalia to Kyoto.
Yoshimitsu managed to piece the symbolic authority of the throne back together. But on a practical, administrative level, the Ashikaga shogunate operated very differently from the previous Kamakura system.
Radically differently. The Kamakura shogunate maintained a strong, deliberate geographic separation, keeping their military headquarters in the east, far away from the aristocratic influence of the court.
Right.
The Ashikaga centralized their physical authority directly in Kyoto, seeking to blend military power with aristocratic prestige.
However, they struggled with severe decentralization of power across the broader provinces.
They didn't have the same tight, micromanaged grip on the regional military governors. The Shugo governors, those provincial governors originally appointed by the Kamakura shogun to merely police the provinces, began to evolve aggressively.
How so?
During the chaos of the dual courts, these governors gained more autonomy, assuming jurisdiction over local land disputes and directly collecting taxes without sending the required portions back to the capital.
They transformed from appointed bureaucrats into what became known as Shugo daimyo, meaning a powerful, independent regional lords.
The term daimyo literally translates to great name. These men were no longer just administrators filling a role. They were entrenched warlords building their own local power bases.
The Ashikaga shogunate lacked a robust, centralized bureaucracy to compel obedience.
They relied heavily on ad hoc alliances and marital ties with these powerful daimyo families to maintain a fragile national coalition.
The shogun's authority was only as strong as the consensus he could build among these warlords.
When the central authority issued a directive, the Shugo daimyo often simply ignored it if it conflicted with their own regional interests.
This leads to what I view as a major historical paradox. We are looking at a government that is highly decentralized, constantly dealing with rebellious regional lords, and operating with a significantly weaker central authority than its predecessor.
Yes.
And yet, the sources universally describe this period as a golden age of cultural achievement. It seems that as the central political power of the Shogun weakened, their cultural patronage and artistic influence peaked.
It appears counterintuitive, but it reveals the strategy the Ashikaga shoguns employed to project their authority. Because their absolute military control was fractured and heavily reliant on consensus, they utilized cultural patronage to legitimize their rule.
They sought to foster refinement among the rough samurai class and elevate their own prestige to match or even exceed the courtly elegance of the traditional aristocracy.
If you cannot dominate the daimyo through sheer force on the battlefield, you outshine them in the pavilion.
You make your court the absolute center of high culture, forcing them to come to you to seek social validation.
That was the political utility of art. Shoguns like Ashikaga Yoshimitsu and later Ashikaga Yoshimasa became massive, dedicated patrons of the arts. They heavily promoted Zen Buddhism, which profoundly influenced the austere, disciplined aesthetics of the era.
The sources outline a whole cultural renaissance emerging directly from this political instability.
We see the deep refinement of No theater during this time.
Theater.
Under the direct patronage of the shogun, a brilliant performer and playwright named Zeami Motokyo elevated No from a rough, rural entertainment into a highly stylized, deeply philosophical, courtly, drama-blending dance, haunting music, and poetic language.
They also formalized the intricate rituals of the tea ceremony and heavily promoted ink monochrome painting, bringing over influences from Ming Dynasty China.
These disciplines were not merely hobbies. They were viewed as essential practices for the spiritual and ethical cultivation of the warrior elite.
The Ashikaga sought to create a new paradigm that blended martial prowess with high culture, proving that the samurai were not just killers but sophisticated rulers.
Perhaps the most enduring physical symbol of this era's cultural priorities is the architecture, specifically the philosophy of wabi-sabi.
Right. Wabi-sabi is an aesthetic philosophy rooted in Zen teachings. It deliberately embraces imperfection, impermanence, and austerity.
It finds deep beauty in the natural, the unrefined, and the aged, rejecting the ostentatious displays of wealth typical of traditional monarchs.
The sources specifically highlight the Ginkakuji, the silver pavilion, built by Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa in 1482.
The silver pavilion perfectly embodies these wabi-sabi ideals. It was designed with contemplative, meticulously raked sand gardens and austere, unpainted wooden architecture.
It was built as a secluded retreat for the shogun to engage in cultural pursuits,
reflecting a deliberate, almost tragic turn away from the chaotic, violent political realities deteriorating outside its walls. Yoshimasa essentially abandoned governing to focus on aesthetics.
But a leader cannot hide in a pavilion forever, no matter how beautiful the sand gardens are. The political realities of decentralization eventually caught up with the Ashikaga.
The factionalism and the unchecked autonomy of the powerful daimyo eventually tore the entire system apart. The catalyst for the final collapse was the Onin War, which erupted in 1467 and lasted a grueling 10 years until 1477.
What specifically sparked a decade of warfare in the capital?
Like many conflicts in hereditary systems, the immediate spark was a bitter dispute over succession within the shogunate itself, entangling the allied clan families.
But because the central authority of the shogun was so weak, he could not mediate the dispute.
Right. Instead, the succession crisis escalated into a massive proxy conflict between rival coalitions of daimyo, who used the crisis as an excuse to settle old scores and grab territory.
And they decided to fight this war right in the streets of the capital.
Kyoto became a war zone. Tens of thousands of samurai engaged in brutal, block-by-block trench warfare within the city.
Great mansions, ancient temples, and vast sections of the capital were burned and reduced to ashes over the course of a decade.
The Onin War effectively destroyed whatever remaining central authority the Ashikaga shogun possessed.
The shogun survived in name, but his actual executive power was completely shattered. The military dictator of Japan was reduced to a helpless bystander in his own ruined capital.
The devastation of the Onin War plunged Japan into the Sengoku period, universally known as the Age of Warring States.
The Age of Warring States.
For the next century, central authority evaporated entirely. Independent warlords across the country fought endless, bloody campaigns for territorial expansion and basic survival.
And the remaining Ashikaga shoguns were reduced to mere puppets, manipulated by whichever regional daimyo managed to march an army into Kyoto.
The era of endless civil war only concludes when a new type of warlord emerges, one willing to utilize unprecedented brutality to clean up the mess and enforce unity.
The final Ashikaga shogun was unceremoniously deposed and exiled in 1573 by Oda Nobunaga,
A fiercely ambitious daimyo who began the arduous process of unifying the fractured nation through sheer military force, deploying new tactics like massed matchlock firearms.
The Ashikaga period demonstrated the fatal dangers of decentralization, giving regional lords too much autonomy, allowing them to control their own taxes and build their own local armies without strict central oversight, inevitably leads to civil war.
The system lacked the rigid institutional controls necessary to prevent the daimyo from challenging the center when it suited them.
Which means that when a new victor finally unified Japan, he would have to engineer a system specifically designed from the ground up to ensure the daimyo could never rebel again. He would have to build an absolute machine of political and social control.
That leads us to the final and most famous iteration of the Bakufu. We move to the Tokugawa Shogunate, an era defined by unprecedented internal peace, strict isolation, and rigid social engineering that lasted from 1603 to 1868.
The century of bloodshed during the Age of Warring States was finally brought to a definitive close by Tokugawa Ieyasu.
Tokugawa Ieyasu was a uniquely brilliant military strategist and an incredibly patient master politician.
He waited out his rivals, built alliances, and finally consolidated supreme military power across Japan after securing a decisive, sweeping victory at the Battle of Sekigahara on October 21st, 1600.
He defeated a massive coalition of rival lords on that battlefield, utilizing betrayals and complex troop movements.
3 years after securing military dominance, the emperor officially formalized his position.
In 1603, Emperor Go-Yozei appointed Ieyasu as Sei Taishogun. But Ieyasu was a student of history. He critically analyzed the failures of the Ashikaga and refused to repeat their mistakes.
He did not base his new government in Kyoto amidst the courtly intrigues and the ruins of past shogunates.
He moved the center of power completely to the east.
He established his capital in Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo.
At the time Ieyasu took control of it, Edo was a relatively small, marshy, coastal fishing village in the eastern Kanto region.
But through massive land reclamation projects and forced labor from his vassals, Ieyasu transformed it into a massive, heavily fortified political and administrative center, dominated by a sprawling, labyrinthine castle complex.
He built his own impregnable fortress far away from the imperial court.
And the sources state he instituted what is called the Bakuhan system. Let's break down how this massive bureaucratic machine actually governed the country.
The term Bakuhan is a combination of two distinct jurisdictional elements. You have the Bakufu, which represents the national central authority of the shogun, operating out of Edo. And you have the Han, which are the individual feudal domains ruled by the regional lords, the daimyo.
So it's a very specific balance between central oversight and local domain control.
It was a meticulously calculated balance. The shogun directly administered his own vast personal territories, which comprised about 1/4 of the most productive arable land in Japan, including the major cities and ports.
He indirectly supervised the daimyo, allowing them to govern their own hand, collect local taxes, and maintain their own local samurai retainers, but only under extremely strict, complex regulations issued by the Bakufu.
Right. And to understand the immense leverage the shogun had over the daimyo, we have to talk about the primary currency of the era. The entire system was built on rice.
Rice.
The economy of Tokugawa Japan was fundamentally agricultural, and wealth, status, and military capability were all measured strictly in rice. The standard unit of measurement utilized by the bureaucracy was the koku.
Let me define that because it's crucial. A koku is roughly defined as the amount of rice required to feed one adult person for a full year.
It's an incredibly tangible measure of wealth.
We're not talking about abstract coinage or speculative value. We are talking about literal caloric sustainment. If you have 10,000 koku, you can feed a standing army of 10,000 men.
Exactly. The entire political and social hierarchy was quantified by the koku. The sources provide specific, granular data from a comprehensive national land survey conducted in 1598.
Okay, what was the data?
At that time, the total agricultural output of the entire Japanese archipelago was assessed at approximately 18.5 million koku.
18.5 million human years of food produced annually.
And of that total national output, the shogun directly controlled roughly 2 million koku generated from his personal lands.
This massive singular revenue stream gave him an insurmountable economic advantage over any single rival lord.
How was the remaining 16 million koku distributed among the hundreds of daimyo?
The distribution was highly uneven by design, intended to prevent any single lord from gaining enough resources to challenge Edo.
Out of all the daimyo in Japan, only one single domain, the Maeda clan in Kaga, was assessed at more than 1 million koku.
Only 22 daimyo out of hundreds had domains producing more than 200,000 koku.
The wealth is heavily concentrated at the very top and deliberately fractured everywhere else.
Furthermore, to even qualify for the status of a daimyo, to be officially recognized by the bakufu as the autonomous ruler of a han, a lord's domain had to produce a strict minimum of 10,000 koku.
If your lands produced 9,900 koku, you were merely a high-ranking retainer to the shogun, or a larger lord, not an independent daimyo.
The shogun has this massive ledger. He knows exactly how much wealth every lord has, down to the last grain of rice.
But knowing their wealth isn't the same as neutralizing them.
Tokugawa Ieyasu and his successors needed a physical mechanical system to ensure these wealthy lords, some of whom still harbored resentment from the civil wars, could never organize an uprising.
The Tokugawa solution to this persistent threat was a mandatory policy called Senkin Kotai, which translates to alternate attendance.
Senkin Kotai.
It remains one of the most effective, elaborate instruments of political control and wealth extraction ever devised by a government.
I want to spend time on this policy because this is where the sheer manipulative genius of the Tokugawa system shines.
Senkin Kotai required every single daimyo in the country to maintain a lavish residence in the capital of Edo.
But they couldn't just visit. They had to alternate their living situation on a rigid schedule.
They would spend 1 year living in their home domain, governing locally, and the next year they were required to live in Edo, serving the shogun.
The requirements were even more severe and calculating, right?
Yes. When a daimyo completed his year in Edo and returned to his domain for his year of local rule, he was explicitly forbidden from taking his family with him.
He was required to leave his wife and his primary heirs behind in his Edo residence.
They were hostages.
Very comfortable hostages living in a mansion, but hostages nonetheless.
They were explicitly hostages of the shogunate. The psychological leverage was absolute.
If a daimyo, sitting in his provincial castle, even considered raising an army or defying an edict, he knew the shogun possessed his entire family within the heavily guarded walls of Edo.
Rebellion meant the immediate execution of his lineage.
The hostage situation guarantees physical compliance, but the true genius of the policy isn't just the hostages. It's the massive financial drain it created.
Right.
I look at this policy, and it is essentially a scheme to force your political rivals to maintain two extremely expensive households, a functioning castle in the province, and a lavish, competitive mansion in the capital.
And then you force them to commute across the country constantly.
The commute was a massive, mandated logistical undertaking. A daimyo was not permitted to travel quietly with a small escort of bodyguards.
The bakufu required them to travel with massive, elaborate retinues that physically reflected their koku status.
We're talking about processions of hundreds, sometimes thousands of samurai, retainers, and servants marching in a grand, highly formalized procession across the country.
And who pays for this massive traveling circus?
The individual daimyo pays for all of it. They bore the entire financial burden.
They paid for the travel? The exorbitant lodging at designated way stations, the food for thousands of men, the constant maintenance of the Edo estate, and the maintenance of their provincial castle.
It entirely drains their bank accounts, so they simply cannot afford to buy weapons, stockpile supplies, or raise a surplus army against the shogun.
It is financial warfare cleverly disguised as a noble political obligation.
The economic impact was staggering. By the year 1700, historians estimate that the requirements of Senkin Kotai consumed up to half and sometimes more of a daimyo's entire annual domain revenue.
They were completely immobilized by mandatory expenses.
But this policy had a massive unintended side effect on the nation. You have thousands of wealthy lords and tens of thousands of samurai constantly traveling back and forth across the mountainous country every single year.
The sheer volume of mandatory travel necessitated the creation of massive infrastructure. The shogunate oversaw the construction and maintenance of an extensive, highly regulated highway network connecting the distant provinces directly to Edo.
These are the famous routes, like the Tokaido Road, which ran along the eastern coast.
To service all these traveling lords, entire economies sprang up. Way stations, inns, tea houses, stables, and merchant markets proliferated along these highways.
The policy designed to impoverish the lords inadvertently boosted nationwide commerce, standardized currency exchange, and spurred massive urban growth.
Edo transformed into one of the largest, most bustling cities in the world entirely because the samurai elite were forced to live and spend their provincial wealth there.
It creates an amazing feedback loop of political control generating nationwide economic development.
But the physical control of the daimyo and their wealth was only one half of the Tokugawa equation. The Bakufu also sought to control the minds and the social fabric of the population to ensure absolute stability.
To achieve total generational stability, the shogunate required a rigid ideological foundation. They adopted and forcefully enforced Neo-Confucianism, specifically the philosophy of the Chinese scholar Zhu Xi, elevating it to the status of state doctrine.
Neo-Confucianism is incredibly heavy on order, duty, knowing your exact place in society, and respecting your superiors without question.
It provided the necessary moral justification for a rigid, unyielding hierarchy. The shogunate utilized this philosophy to establish a strict four-class system.
Social mobility, which had been fluid during the Warring States period, was virtually eliminated. You were born into your class, you married within your class, and you died in your class.
Let's run through the specific order of the four classes because it tells you exactly what the shogunate valued.
At the very apex, naturally, were the warriors, the samurai class, comprising roughly 6% of the population.
Below them, recognized for their vital contribution, were the farmers.
Below the farmers were the artisans, who crafted goods.
And at the very bottom of the recognized social ladder were the merchants.
There's a quote in the sources from a prominent Japanese Confucian philosopher named Ogyo Sorai that perfectly encapsulates the official justification for this specific ranking.
What does he say?
He wrote, "The peasant cultivates the fields and feeds the people. The artisan makes utensils, and the people use them. The merchant exchanges what one has for what one needs and helps the people. The samurai rules so that disorders will not arise."
That quote perfectly illustrates the orthodox Confucian worldview enforced by the Bakufu. The intrinsic value of a class was determined by what they physically produced for society.
The warriors were valued highest because they maintained the essential order and governed.
The farmers were elevated to the second tier because they produced the most critical resource for survival food.
Artisans created useful, tangible goods.
But I have to push back on the classification of the merchants at the very bottom. Looking at global history, capital usually equates to power. Why deliberately place the people controlling the movement of money and goods at the absolute bottom of the social ladder?
Under strict orthodox Confucian theory, merchants were viewed as societal parasites.
Parasites!
They did not produce anything tangible from the earth like a farmer, nor did they craft anything with their hands like an artisan. They merely moved existing goods around and extracted profit off the labor of others.
In the eyes of the samurai administrators, money dealings were considered inherently immoral, crass, and deeply corrupting to the desired social order.
So in theory, the samurai are noble, disciplined administrators, and the merchants are lowly, greedy parasites. But what actually happens to that rigid theory over 2 centuries of absolute, uninterrupted peace?
Right, the reality of the Edo period deeply contradicted the state-mandated theory. Because there were no wars to fight for over 200 years, the samurai had no opportunity to earn new lands or acquire new wealth through conquest.
They were transformed into idle bureaucrats, paid fixed, inherited stipends in rice by their daimyo.
And as the economy monetized, moving away from barter and the cost of living in booming urban centers like Edo skyrocketed, a fixed income paid in rice doesn't stretch very far.
The samurai class grew increasingly impoverished. Yet they were legally required to maintain the outward appearance of their high status, maintaining their armor, their swords, and their households.
To bridge the gap, they were forced to borrow money.
And who do they have to borrow money from?
The merchants.
Despite their lowly legal status, the merchants in major commercial hubs like Edo and Osaka amassed staggering fortunes through commerce, banking, and aggressively lending at high interest rates to the desperate, cash-poor samurai class.
The merchants gained immense, unofficial political influence through their sheer economic power. They patronized the vibrant urban culture, the kabuki theaters, and the pleasure quarters.
The official legal hierarchy remained rigidly in place, but the financial reality of the nation was completely inverted.
It proves that a government can legislate morality and mandate social standing, but it cannot legislate basic economics. The sources also detail the role of women in this society and how those roles were heavily dictated by this same rigid class structure.
Neo-Confucianism places a profound emphasis on filial piety and strict patriarchal obedience. Women across all classes were generally expected to defer to their male family members, first to their fathers, then their husbands, and finally their sons.
However, the practical application of these rules varied significantly depending on your designated social class.
So a peasant woman working a farm experienced this hierarchy very differently than a samurai woman living in a castle.
Absolutely. Lower class women, particularly those in farming families or artisan workshops, often worked in the fields or the shops alongside men.
Because their physical labor was essential to the family's basic economic survival, they retained a degree of practical autonomy.
The sources note that lower-class women often had slightly more freedom to initiate divorce or manage household finances compared to their upper-class counterparts.
Whereas for the elite women, the rules were much tighter.
For women in the upper echelons, specifically the samurai class, marriages were rarely about personal choice or affection. They were vital strategic political alliances arranged by clan leaders to secure power.
Upper-class women were bound by much stricter codes of behavior, faced severe limitations on their freedom of movement, and bore the heavy expectations of producing heirs and maintaining clan honor.
Their lives were closely monitored and largely confined within the walls of the estates.
The shogunate controlled the daimyo through Sankin-kotai. They controlled the social hierarchy through Neo-Confucianism. They controlled the economy. They managed almost every internal variable.
There was only one variable left to control to ensure total enduring stability:
The outside world. They had to eliminate the unpredictable variable of foreign influence.
The Tokugawa enacted a severe policy of national seclusion, known as sakoku.
Beginning in the 1630s, the shogunate issued a series of sweeping edicts that effectively closed the Japanese archipelago to the broader world.
They explicitly banned Japanese citizens from traveling overseas upon pain of death, and they severely restricted foreign entry into the country.
What was the primary motivation for such a drastic, isolationist step? Was it purely economic protectionism?
The primary catalyst was not economic. It was the perceived existential threat of Christianity. Spanish and Portuguese Catholic missionaries had arrived in the mid-16th century and had successfully converted hundreds of thousands of Japanese, including several prominent and powerful daimyo in the southern domains.
If a daimyo answers to the Pope in Rome, or feels a religious kinship with the King of Spain, he might not answer to the shogun in Edo.
The shogunate viewed Christianity as a deeply subversive foreign ideology that fundamentally undermined the absolute loyalty required by the Neo-Confucian social order.
They feared it could be utilized by European powers as a precursor to colonization, as had happened in the Philippines.
The Bakufu ruthlessly suppressed the religion, forcing mass conversions, outlawing the practice, and executing those who refused to recant. Sakoku was explicitly designed to cut off the source of that subversive influence.
But the seclusion wasn't absolute. It wasn't a total hermetic seal on the borders.
It was a highly managed, tightly controlled interaction. Trade and diplomatic relations continued, heavily regulated, with regional neighbors like Korea and the Ryukyu Kingdom.
And they did allow one specific group of Europeans to remain, but under extremely tight security conditions.
The Dutch. Because the Protestant Dutch were primarily interested in commerce and had demonstrated no desire to proselytize or send missionaries, the shogunate allowed them to maintain a highly lucrative trading post.
However, they were restricted to a tiny artificial fan-shaped island called Deshima, constructed in the harbor of Nagasaki.
They were literally confined to an artificial island to prevent them from physically contaminating the mainland with foreign ideas.
Their presence was strictly monitored by bakufu officials, but it provided the shogunate with a vital controlled window into the outside world.
Through the Dutch, the shogunate received regular reports on global events and imported Western texts on medicine, astronomy, and military science, an intellectual pursuit known as Dutch learning.
The Tokugawa Shogunate achieved something truly remarkable. Over 2 centuries of unbroken internal peace.
They built massive, sophisticated cities, fostered a thriving internal commercial economy, and cultivated a rich, distinct cultural identity.
They managed a society with a standard of living, literacy rates, and urban infrastructure that was exceptionally high for the pre-modern world.
They succeeded in engineering a profoundly stable, internally harmonious, self-contained universe.
But an artificially closed system cannot withstand the pressure of a rapidly industrializing outside world forever. The walls they built eventually have to come down.
And when those walls were finally breached, the entire 700-year structure of military rule collapsed with astonishing, unprecedented speed.
Which brings us to the mid-19th century, the dramatic fall of the shogunate and its enduring legacy.
By the mid-19th century, the internal foundations of the Tokugawa regime were already severely decaying. The economic inversion we discussed earlier had reached a critical crisis point.
The samurai were deeply impoverished, highly indebted, and growing deeply resentful of the system that kept them poor while the merchants grew rich.
The daimyo domains were heavily in debt to the merchant class in Osaka. Furthermore, there was growing, volatile unrest among the rural population.
Peasants were frequently revolting over high taxation and a series of devastating famines that the bakufu failed to manage effectively.
The strict, rigid social order was fracturing under the weight of complex economic reality.
The system was fragile and hollowed out from the inside. It just needed a massive shock from the outside to shatter it completely.
That shock arrived in the summer of 1853. United States Commodore Matthew Perry sailed a squadron of heavily armed, steam-powered warships right into Edo Bay, bypassing the restricted port of Nagasaki entirely.
The Japanese referred to them as the Black Ships. I imagine the psychological impact of seeing massive, smoke-belching steamships heavily armed with modern cannons anchoring right outside the capital city.
It must have been terrifying for a samurai class that still fought primarily with swords and outdated matchlocks.
It induced absolute panic within the government. Perry carried a letter from the U.S. president demanding that Japan open its ports to American trade and provide coaling stations for whaling ships.
He made it abundantly clear, through a display of his naval artillery, that he would utilize overwhelming military force if the demands were ignored.
The shogunate is suddenly facing a technologically superior foreign navy anchored mere miles from their capital, and they have no navy of their own to counter it.
The bakufu was paralyzed by indecision. They recognized immediately that they lacked the military capability to defeat the Western warships.
After frantic, divisive internal debates among the ruling councils, they concluded resistance was futile and capitulated.
Over the next few years, the shogunate signed a series of agreements that became known as the Unequal Treaties, not just with the United States, but subsequently with Britain, Russia, and other European imperial powers.
These treaties were devastating to Japanese sovereignty. They forced Japan to open multiple ports to foreign trade, dictated heavily disadvantageous low tariffs, and granted foreign citizens extraterritoriality, meaning foreigners operating in Japan were subject only to their own foreign laws, not Japanese law.
It was a massive public humiliation for the bakufu.
And it struck at the very core of the shogun's fundamental legitimacy. Think back to the literal translation of the title we discussed at the very beginning of this deep dive, Sei Taishogun, Commander-in-Chief of the Expeditionary Force against the barbarians.
If the commander-in-chief is demonstrably incapable of protecting the sacred nation from the new, technologically advanced barbarians and their steamships, then what conceivable purpose does the shogun serve?
The legal fiction shattered completely. The signing of these humiliating treaties destroyed the shogunate's prestige and stripped away their aura of invincibility.
Dissident samurai from the powerful, historically anti-Tokugawa southern domains, particularly Satsuma and Choshu, seized upon this glaring weakness.
They adopted a potent political slogan, Sono Joy, which translates to revere the emperor, expel the barbarians.
They brilliantly used the anger over the foreign incursions to rally the nation around the one figurehead who had remained unsullied by the diplomatic failure, the emperor in Kyoto.
The internal political crisis swiftly erupted into a brief but highly decisive civil conflict known as the Boshin War, which lasted from 1868 to 1869.
The imperial loyalist forces, heavily armed with modern Western rifles and artillery they had illicitly purchased, marched against the outdated armies of the Tokugawa Bakufu.
The writing was on the wall for the shogunate. The system could no longer sustain itself.
The final shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, recognized the absolute futility of fighting a prolonged, destructive civil war that could easily invite opportunist foreign intervention and colonization.
In a historic move, he officially resigned and formally relinquished his executive power back to the imperial throne.
That momentous shift occurred on January 3, 1868.
This pivotal event is known as the Meiji Restoration. Emperor Meiji assumed direct, absolute rule over the nation.
The position of shogun, which had defined Japanese politics for centuries, was permanently abolished.
Nearly 700 years of military rule ended. The Bakufu was dismantled, the ancient samurai class was officially abolished shortly thereafter, and Japan rapidly, aggressively modernized into a formidable industrial empire.
It was a sudden, sweeping, and total dismantling of a deeply entrenched feudal structure.
But an institution that rules a nation for 7 centuries does not just disappear without a trace. 700 years of military rule leaves a permanent, indelible mark on a nation's cultural DNA.
The legacy of the shogunate remains deeply embedded in modern Japanese identity. The core ethos of the samurai, the Bushido Code emphasizing absolute loyalty, personal honor, fierce discipline, and duty, was deliberately transformed by the new government from a specific warrior class rule into a pervasive national ideal during the rapid modernization period.
It became an integral part of the broader cultural fabric, utilized to unite a rapidly changing nation.
Furthermore, the massive urban centers like Tokyo and Osaka, the intricate infrastructure networks like the Tokaido Road, and the remarkably high levels of literacy and complex bureaucratic administration developed during the long peace of the Edo period laid the exact necessary foundations for Japan's shockingly rapid industrialization and emergence as a world power.
And the cultural arts that were refined, patronized, and protected by the shoguns, the elegant no theater, the meditative tea ceremony, the profound aesthetics of wabi-sabi, those remain the defining pillars of traditional Japanese culture recognized globally to this day.
The shoguns may have ultimately lost their political power, but the complex, highly regulated society they engineered irrevocably shaped the trajectory of the modern nation.
We have covered a massive expanse of history today, charting the rise, the evolution, and the sudden fall of one of the most fascinating political institutions in human history.
To close out our exploration of the shogunate, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We've spent this entire time dissecting the absolute power of the shoguns. They engineered complex social hierarchies, they commanded armies that defeated the greatest military empire on Earth, and they successfully isolated an entire nation from the global stage for centuries. But the most incredible fact is this. The entire 700-year history of the shogunate was built entirely on a delicate legal fiction. These military dictators wielded absolute life-and-death power, yet not a single one of them ever dared to replace the emperor.
It is a profoundly rare historical phenomenon where absolute, undeniable military supremacy voluntarily submitted to symbolic religious authority for 7 centuries.
It proves a compelling point about the nature of governance. Physical force and the threat of violence alone are never enough to govern a nation indefinitely without deep, enduring, and unassailable cultural legitimacy. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.